Welcome to the Foundation Series, your deep dive into startup compensation with industry leaders from across the startup world. Join me, Matt McFarlane, a people operations leader turned compensation specialist, as we uncover the strategies and practices driving success in tech startups around the world. Hear insights from heads of people, founders, and experts as we explore how to build robust compensation frameworks that not only fuel growth and retention, but do so in the dynamic startup environment that we all know and love. Let's get into it. Today's episode is one I've been genuinely excited to record. I'm joined by Melissa Theiss, head of people at Kit and founder of Fledge, which is a consultancy helping people leaders think like business leaders. If you've seen Melissa's content on LinkedIn, you'll know she brings a sharp commercial lens to people strategy, and this conversation is no exception. In this episode, we're getting into how startups can reject cookie cutter compensation models, how to build a comp philosophy that's truly fit for purpose, and the power of principle-led decision-making. Let's dive in. All right, welcome to the Foundation Series. Melissa Theiss, I have been so excited to have this conversation with you. I think I've certainly been fangirling over your content on LinkedIn for a long time. I think you have such a really interesting commercial lens to a lot of the different things that you talk about under the sort of head of HR within a startup remit. So really excited to welcome you to the Foundation Series. I'd love it if you'd spend a quick minute introducing yourself for those who maybe aren't as familiar with you as I am, and then we can dive into our exciting episode.
Sure. So Melissa Theiss, I'm a 4-time head of business and people operations, currently the head of people operations at Kit, the email-first operating system for creators who mean business. I'm also the founder and principal of Fledge, an HR consulting firm that helps people leaders think like business leaders. So very appropriate for how you view my content on LinkedIn. Good to hear.
Absolutely. And amazing to have you here. All right. So in today's episode, I was really excited to talk to you about how to avoid cookie cutter compensation. I think it's so relevant for startups because they're obviously in this really interesting, often constrained environment where cash isn't really something that they tend to have a lot of, certainly not at the earlier levels. And I think this is kind of like tried and true sort of formula for a lot of startups where they tend to be really light on cash, heavy on equity at the start. And then we see that model tend to invert the more mature and maybe the more funding rounds that an organization gets. I know you've got some really interesting examples and experiences in this space, but I'd really love to start the conversation today by understanding how can startups really think about comp as something that's truly unique to them? How can they make sure there's not something that is cookie cutter that every other startup on the block at their stage is looking at?
Yeah, I think it starts by figuring out what your philosophy is. So my perspective is that business strategy should drive your talent strategy, and your talent strategy should drive your compensation strategy. And most founders and leaders can articulate their business strategy. And from there, they can extrapolate their talent strategy, but getting to the compensation strategy is where things start to get a little bit fuzzy. So the way that I usually start is by asking a series of executive interview questions. So things like, what type of talent do we want to attract? What type of talent do we want to retain? Over what time horizon? Do we need a particular set of skills here? Do we want to be hiring in certain geographic markets? Why or why not? Under what conditions does our compensation need to be financially feasible? Do we want our compensation to drive any type of cultural behaviors? Like, do we want it to drive collectivism? Do we want it to drive individualism? So I have these series of conversations or questions that I'll ask to guide a conversation with the executives. And it's fascinating to hear them disagree with each other about these topics that they've never discussed at the root before. They've just debated the outcomes of, like it's signing bonus, yes or no, or like this, yes or no. And so to really get to the root. And so I have people translate that into like 5 to 8 compensation design principles. And once you have your design principles, it becomes this framework, almost like a litmus test that you use to design or refine every single compensation, pay practice or pay policy from there.
Yeah, I love that. And I agree so much. It's, rather than trying to debate the relevance of a particular outcome, it's like, let's go back to, this sort of core foundational truth that we hold around how pay should work and how can that inform the decision that we make. How do you tend to I mean, these, even at that level, I tend to find there can be a little bit of, disagreement and some really good, robust discussion. What do you tend to find is a great way to ultimately land in a place that's a little bit more harmonious where we've got these kind of 5 to 8 design principles?
Amongst the leadership team, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one is just understanding the decision-making process of the executive team as a whole. Like, are they a consensus-based group, or do they vote? Is it founder-driven? Like, what are their principles for decision-making generally? And then apply that for their philosophy for disagree and commit. And sometimes a framework that I use all the time for decision-making is what's called even over. So I'll say, like, how would you value this even over that? And then force people to do a rank order of a series of things. But oftentimes you can find a series of principles that just get at different concepts or different ideas that can work harmoniously together, that don't compete with one another. They're just getting at different ideas or perspectives. And as long as an executive can see themselves represented in that perspective, that's what's most important. But at the end of the day, if you can't get full consensus, most companies, especially if we're talking about startups, they should reflect the founder and CEO, right? And if it's a set of founders, they have a set of practices, or they should work with a founder counselor to figure out how to mediate disagreements amongst themselves. But I've generally been pretty successful at being able to whittle it down to 5 to 8 design principles. And then that is like the framework for everything that we do from there. It makes it a lot easier to have the conversations about specific pay practices and pay policies.
Yeah, I love that that even or. Can we sort of dive into that a little bit more? I'd love, like, I don't know if you've got like a recent example where this is something you've applied and how that's worked, but how does it sort of work in practice? How have you helped it sort of tie break on some of these decisions?
Yeah, I mean, if we were talking about budgeting and like in terms of how you would distribute your compensation, oftentimes it comes up to like, how are we distributing our compensation? How are we distributing it to new hires versus to existing team members for market-based compensation versus internal equity? And you might say, like, how are we going to value this? Are we going to give compensation to a new hire even over an existing team member? And if people can't decide on that and they're like, well, it kind of depends, like a random new hire, no, compared to, an existing average performer, but a great new hire who comes with a referral even over a low performer. And then you start to tease it out. And it's like, okay, so our concept here is that we're going to, be willing to negotiate on compensation for new hires if they have strong yeses in, 3/4 of their scorecards or more, and not in other situations. But we would never place them above an existing team member unless that existing team member was not meeting expectations. And you don't always need to get that granular, right? But oftentimes, like, you just say 2 things can't be equal, because at the end of the day, especially if it's a dollar, like, unless you're going to split the dollar, which most times you're not, and you're actually talking about thousands of dollars, like, it has to go to one person or another, or to one initiative or another. And so forcing the ranking of it and then having people silently write their rankings and then compare their rankings often helps you to identify where the disagreement is. And then you can negotiate based on people's interests, like what they're trying to accomplish, not just their positions, which is how they were trying to accomplish it. And it opens up a lot more avenues to reach an agreement.
Yeah, I so love that, because my experience when it comes to compensation philosophies and just compensation as general is that, like, you're trying to achieve 2 things for both yourself as like a HR team, but also for the workforce if you're considering pay transparency and things like that. One is you really want to be clear about what it is that you are trying to pay as a company. And the second is you really want to be consistent. And I think even if the executive team is getting is this really granular level, it's such a great way to form the sort of practices and just define and get clear and aligned around how these things are going to work in practice, so that when you are rolling it out, it is something you can just adhere to or start to iterate on if it's no longer meeting some of the core guiding principles. But yeah, I love that approach and that framework. I think that would probably be something that I would definitely adopt to help resolve some of the issues that I see come up in guiding principle setting processes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's easier to share your guiding principles with a larger audience, both internal and external, than some of these more granular decisions. So you can decide still like where you want to be in terms of transparency. And again, this kind of comes down to one of your principles in terms of transparency. But I often think about compensation transparency as being an team member being able to answer, why am I paid? What am I paid? what do I actually earn and how do I earn more over time? So why, what, how? And they can
Yeah.
answer that at different levels at different companies, but they should fundamentally be able to answer those three questions everywhere. And so it's just like, how do you help guide the executive team to give them answers to those questions, even if the executive team has more detailed answers to those questions?
Yeah, it's so true. And I think you're hitting on something that I talk about a lot with clients is like you want to think about sort of both ends of the spectrum of how your comp practices are going to land. You obviously want to build something that's going to work really well internally and operationally, but you also need to think about how it lands for the individual, and it has to ultimately work for them, because otherwise they're not going to come and work for you, or they're certainly not going to stay long at your company. And so answering some of these really personal questions around how pay is digested by the individual and how they can move within your pay system is so critical to being, sure that it's actually going to work. And yes, being really honed in and dialed into the business model and the funding strategy and those sorts of things about your company are relevant to forming your pay practices. Actually, thinking of the human in the loop and how they actually interact with that is just as critical. Speaking of which, I think this sort of next question that I have really gets to the core of how I think you can make your pay practices work really effectively for you. I often advocate for companies with nothing in place when it comes to comp philosophy to just document what they have. Like everyone kind of does something already when it comes to comp philosophies or comp practices. How often they refresh them, how often they do pay reviews, how someone might get a pay increase, those sorts of questions that typically companies have a readily available answer to. But this next part is really around how to actually kind of supercharge that and turn it into something that works effectively for you. It's actually about like the comp design piece. Let's talk about how we actually translate business model or funding strategy or these talent priorities into the actual compensation principles that shape the pay practices. I'd love to, maybe hear some examples from you around how this has worked in the past and some ways in which the audience might be able to apply that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it really does come back to business strategy drives talent strategy drives compensation strategy. And one thing I fundamentally believe about talent strategy, which is controversial and I don't think it should be, is a really good talent strategy should compel and repel. It should actively draw in people who will ultimately be really successful at your organization, but it should also push away people who will not be successful at your organization. You're not trying to appeal to everyone under the sun. Your compensation philosophy, your employer brand, how you do your performance reviews, it will turn off some people, and that is okay. You're not trying to please everyone. You never will. So I think you just need to accept that first and foremost. But then think about like, what are you trying to accomplish as a business, and who do you really need to be able to accomplish that from a talent perspective? So using some specific examples. So a company that I worked at quite a while ago now, Quorum, we were founded on Harvard's college campus by 2 undergrads. The initial team of 10 was almost entirely college dropouts that anticipated going back to college at some point. And the software was government affairs software at the time, serving almost exclusively early career individuals, serving legislators on Capitol Hill. And so the idea is that we wanted really high-powered, high-talent people who wanted exposure to other high-powered, high-talent people, and were willing to work extremely long hours for low pay. That was the pitch. And that's clearly not going to appeal to everyone. And we're like, okay, like how do we draw that in? And so what we did is we developed really strong relationships with top tier universities. We ran an excessively large internship program for the size of the company as a whole. We did intentionally choose to offer a paid internship program, a fairly well paid internship program, when a lot of the White House internships and others in Washington, D.C. are unpaid internships, which makes them financially inaccessible, particularly from people from lower socioeconomic brackets. So we were appealing to people on financial aid at top tier universities in lower socioeconomic brackets, willing to work for little amounts, but not able to work for nothing, like some of their higher socioeconomic status peers. And we delivered them a really amazing communal experience. They lived in these houses in Friendship Heights with the software engineers, with each other. It was like the college experience expanded into a work experience. And then when we offered them full-time jobs, we intentionally paid at the 25th percentile because this was a bootstrapped company funded on almost nothing, literally a shoestring budget. We actually did Rover, the old school version of Rover, and like used dogs that stayed with the engineers during the day to help fund the company. Like that's how much money this company had. And we were open about it, right? Like we published the compensation on the job description long before it was legally required. And that strategy made sense for that context of the type of person that we were trying to appeal to. And we were open about it. Now, if you went out and said on LinkedIn, like, we're intentionally paying at the 25th percentile, people would be like, what? That is wild. Why would you do that? But for a company that wanted early career talent, it was okay with turnover because the industry had high turnover. The value prop was exposure and opportunity. And we were specifically offering an incentive short term that other opportunities didn't offer. And we're clear about the long-term rewards. And as a bootstrap company, your equity stake was larger than what you would get at a venture backed company, and it wouldn't be diluted. There was something there for the right type of person. And so that's one example. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you hit on two things actually that, would probably be contentious on LinkedIn. One is that, yes, your comp should repel people. Absolutely. I mean, like you said, if you try to appeal to everyone, you appeal to nobody. But the second is that, from my perspective, it's okay to pay at 25th percentile. Someone's got to,
Yes.
right? It's just statistics. Like someone has to be in that category. And I think so long as, it's both parties are willing to form that employment relationship, then that's okay. And, certainly as long as you're not contravening any minimum wage laws, but, that's okay. Someone has to pay 25th percentile, and it's right for some companies. And it sounds like it was right for this one. I like as well, in fact, I love that, there's an element of like, you sort of wear your heart on your sleeve around the kind of company that you are and like what's great about it and what's not. And it reminds me, as you were speaking, there was that like really famous job ad from like decades ago of like, it was in the newspaper. It's used all the time in universities, I think, where it was like, trip to the Antarctic, high likelihood of death, but, high certainty of glory. And it was just, brutally honest, right? And they had, what was it, a line around the block of people who were, that read that and were like, hey, I have a chance at glory of something that I may not have that really meets my need. And I think there's so much wisdom in just being like, know exactly who it is that you're trying to attract and optimize for them. And yeah, I love that example. Let's do like one or two more. What else have you got? Because I feel like this wisdom is super helpful.
Yeah. The one other thing I'll add on this previous example before we move on is another fake idea, I guess, that people hold on to is if you pay at the 25th percentile, you get like poor talent. I have never worked with a higher concentration of Ivy League grads. Not that Ivy League grad is a direct translation to quality of talent. It's not. There are wonderful people out there who did or did not go to college and come from a variety of backgrounds. But like the average customer support specialist was a top 10% Duke grad, and we paid 25th percentile. Like, so just like I think there is not anywhere nearly as strong of a relationship between where you pay on the pay percentile and the quality of talent that you get as people think. Conversely, I've worked places that paid 98th percentile, and our talent honestly was not all that good. Like,
Well,
I
it's
don't
so
think the
true, isn't
relationship
it?
is as strong as people think. It's more about how you position and who you're going after and what other things that you offer as well. Okay, then let's switch gears. Other example, so venture-backed company. We were really well funded, and we wanted people to be focused on serving our mission and not gaming our compensation system. People knew that we had a variety of funds, and we didn't want people to constantly be coming after it. And so our philosophy in general was what we called Standard-Skewed-Generous. We intentionally designed really simple and limited sales incentive compensation plans. That was part of our philosophy, but one of the ways that looked in practice is anytime an incentive plan was designed that had more than two components, I would push back on it if it had three or more. If I couldn't describe it over the phone to a candidate in 15 seconds or less, I would push back on it and say it's too complicated. There are too many opportunities for it to be gained. And then we would also say that if there was something that came up that wasn't covered by the plan, because we weren't trying to cover an exhaustive set of every possible rule under the sun, because we were trying to keep it simple. In situations where it was small dollar amounts, we would just be standard skewed generous and default in favor of the team member instead of defaulting in favor of the company. So very different
Yeah.
environment, very different way that we would apply. policies.
I love that. And again, you have to be able to describe your compensation practices simply, because at the end of the day, they're there to incentivize and they're there to reward. And if the link between the outcome and the incentive is severed because it's too complex to understand, then guess what? It's probably not going to incentivize the right outcomes, right? Because if people look at their pay every week or fortnight or month and they don't understand how that number was arrived at, it's probably not having the effect that you're wanting. So that's another great example. These are awesome. These are some really great practical examples. Thank you so much for those examples.
I am glad I've worked in public companies and venture-backed and bootstrapped. They all gave me useful exposure and learnings, and now I know my happy place. Companies
Absolutely.
that actually have to earn profits by delivering value.
That's a wrap on today's episode, and what a conversation. Melissa shared some hard-hitting truths about comp strategy, from why your pay model should repel as well as attract, to how startups can use design principles to drive consistency and clarity. If you take one thing away, let it be this: compensation isn't just about benchmarking, it's a strategic tool that shapes behavior, culture, and business outcomes. Thanks for joining us on another edition of the Foundation Series. Make sure to head over to our website to subscribe to the Foundation Series for monthly editions featuring future interviews on startup compensation. In each edition, we'll explore the different strategies, trends, and challenges faced by startups around the world. If you have a burning topic you'd like me to cover or a standout guest that you want to hear from, drop me an email so I can dive deeper into the compensation topics that matter most to you. Join me next time as we continue to uncover the strategies and practices driving success in global tech startups around the world. Thanks for listening.